The ice held the geese, but Silas finally saw the reflection he'd been fleeing in its dark water, his own freedom, waiting to be claimed. Silas Morrow scraped frost from the windshield of his rusted pickup before sunrise, the familiar ache in his knuckles a dull counterpoint to the sharper pang of leaving. Again. The metal blade scratched against glass with the sound of resignation itself, each stroke revealing more of the gray Oklahoma dawn that promised nothing. 30 years he'd watched this same sun rise over the Hammond farm outside Bison, 30 years of being a ghost caretaker for owners who existed only in monthly checks that grew smaller and arrived later each time. The final payment notice crumpled in his jacket pocket wasn't just paper anymore, it was the sound of the last tether snapping. His weathered fingers, stiff from arthritis and cold, fumbled with truck keys that felt heavier than they should. The engine coughed to life like an old man clearing his throat, and Silas sat for a moment in the cab's familiar embrace of cracked vinyl and diesel fumes, watching his breath cloud the air. Behind him, the farmhouse sagged like a tired animal, its porch steps worn smooth by his boots and no one else's. The barn doors hung askew, revealing shadows that once held purpose. 40 head of cattle had become 12, then 4, then sold to pay what couldn't be paid anyway. The silence had grown so thick over the years that Silas sometimes forgot the sound of his own voice, talking only to the wind and the occasional hawk circling overhead. He stepped out of the truck, boots crunching on frost-hardened earth that sounded like breaking glass. The fence line stretched ahead of him, barbed wire catching the pale light like a rosary of rust and regret. One last walk, he'd promised himself. One last check of gates that kept nothing in and nothing out, posts that stood sentinel over emptiness. The cold bit through his jacket, but Silas barely noticed. He'd learned to carry winter inside himself long ago. The crunch of frozen ground under his feet marked time like a metronome of departure. Each step took him further from the truck, deeper into the ritual of goodbye he'd been rehearsing for months without knowing it. The air smelled of wood smoke from some distant chimney and the metallic bite of coming snow, scents that would follow him wherever he went next, if there was a next, if there was anywhere left to go. As he reached the first corner post, Silas paused to run his gloved hand along the wood, feeling the rough texture through worn leather. 30 years of checking this fence, 30 years of maintenance that kept the world out and him in. The wood was solid still, unlike everything else. Unlike him. The irony wasn't lost. He'd maintained everything except himself, tended everything except his own withering. The morning stretched before him with the awful promise of emptiness. No cattle to check, no chores to lose himself in, no reason to return tomorrow or any day after. Just the highway leading away from Bison, away from the only place that had ever felt like purpose, even if it was borrowed purpose, even if it was never really his. The Hammond farm would die with his leaving, but something told him he'd been dying with it long before this morning came. The stock pond appeared around the bend of the fence line like a gray mirror dropped from heaven, its surface a sheet of black glass reflecting the pale sky. Silas had built this pond himself 15 years ago, digging with borrowed equipment and dreams of better seasons. Now it held winter in its grip, ice forming at the edges where the water met the muddy banks he'd shaped with his own hands. But something was wrong with the reflection. 2 shapes struggled against the ice near the center. Canada geese, their wings flapping uselessly against the thickening surface that trapped them like amber. Their cries cut through the dawn silence, desperate and guttural, a sound that froze Silas mid-stride not with cold, but with recognition. He knew that sound. He'd been making it silently for 30 years. The larger goose, probably the male, beat his wings against the ice with decreasing force, each attempt weaker than the last. His mate pressed close, her smaller frame shivering as she called to him in a language of panic that needed no translation. They'd been there all night, Silas realized, watching the water slowly claim them while he'd sat in his truck, wrestling with keys and memories. He knelt at the pond's muddy edge, his knees sinking into frost-softened earth that held the impression of his boots from countless other mornings. The geese saw him and their cries intensified, but they couldn't move toward help, couldn't move toward anything except the slow surrender ice demanded. Their dark eyes reflected his own desperation back at him, and something cracked open in Silas's chest that had nothing to do with the cold. "I know," he whispered to them, his voice rusty from disuse. "I know exactly how that feels." The water between them showed more than sky. It showed 30 years of struggling against invisible ice, 30 years of wings beating uselessly against circumstances that never warmed, never loosened their grip. He'd been those geese, grounded and fighting against a freeze that had claimed him so gradually he'd never noticed when movement became impossible. Steam rose from his breath as he watched their struggle, and in that vapor he saw all the words he'd never spoken, all the choices he'd never made, all the chances that had frozen over while he tended someone else's land and lived someone else's diminished version of life. The geese cried out again, weaker now, and Silas felt the sound in his bones. He could break the ice. He had tools in the truck, a steel bar that could crack the surface and free them. But he didn't move. Instead, he sat back on his heels and really looked at the geese, at the water, at the reflection that showed him not just the sky above but the trapped life below. His own face stared back from the dark surface, older than he remembered, more weathered than he'd admitted, but still there. Still breathing. Still capable of choice. The terrible recognition that had stopped him in his tracks began to shift into something else. The ice held the geese, but it also held their reflection, and his. In that dark mirror, he saw not just what was trapped, but what was waiting. What had always been waiting, beneath the surface of resignation he'd mistaken for acceptance. The geese had stopped struggling, conserving energy in the way wild things learned when survival became a waiting game. Silas understood this too, the terrible patience of the trapped, the way hope could freeze over just like water, gradually and then all at once. He'd been conserving energy for 30 years, living small and quiet, making himself invisible in case someone noticed he didn't really belong anywhere. His reflection in the black water showed him truths he'd spent decades avoiding. The lines around his eyes weren't just from squinting into prairie sun. They were from the slow constriction of dreams deferred until they suffocated. His bent shoulders weren't just from carrying feed sacks and fixing fence. They were from carrying the weight of other people's choices while refusing to make his own. "My daddy left when I was 12, he said to the geese, surprised to hear his voice in the dawn quiet. Said he was going to find work in Tulsa. That was 1963. The words hung in the cold air like visible things, shaped by his breath into small ghosts that dissipated slowly. Mama waited 5 years for him to come back. Kept his coffee cup on the table every morning, kept his side of the bed made neat. The female goose turned her head toward him, one dark eye fixed on his face as if she understood the weight of waiting. Her mate had tucked his head beneath his wing, but his breathing still steamed in small puffs above the ice. "I waited too," Silas continued, his voice gaining strength from use. "Different kind of waiting. Waited for my real life to start, I guess. Kept thinking if I just worked hard enough, stayed quiet enough, didn't ask for too much, maybe someone would notice I was worth keeping around." He laughed, a sound like bark cracking in frost. 30 years of being the perfect employee, the reliable one, the man who never complained even when the paychecks got smaller and the promises got thinner. The water lapped gently against the ice, a sound like whispered secrets. In its dark surface, Silas could see not just his face but the shadow of every choice he'd never made, every risk he'd never taken, every time he'd chosen safety over the terrifying possibility of being truly seen. The Hammonds had never known his first name was actually Solomon. His mother had called him that after the wise king, hoping he'd grow into wisdom. But wisdom without courage was just another kind of trap. "You know what the worst part is?" he asked the geese, leaning forward until his breath created small clouds over the water. "I convinced myself this was noble. Being invisible, being dependable, never asking for anything I wanted. Called it virtue when it was really just fear dressed up in work clothes." The male goose lifted his head then, meeting Silas's eyes across the narrow stretch of black water. In that moment, trapped animal to trapped man, Something passed between them that had nothing to do with rescue and everything to do with recognition. They were both caught in circumstances beyond their control, but only one of them had chosen his trap, day after day, year after year, until the bars had become invisible and the cage had become called home. Silas rolled up his sleeve and plunged his hand into the icy water, not to break the ice but to touch the cold that had been numbing him for decades. The shock of it traveled up his arm like lightning, waking nerves he'd thought were dead. His reflection shattered into pieces, then reformed as the water settled, showing him fragments of himself he'd forgotten existed. "The ice is breaking," he told the geese, though the surface around them remained solid. "Not out there. In here." He pressed his free hand to his chest, feeling his heart beat against his palm like something wild trying to escape. 30 years too late, but breaking just the same. The first crack appeared not in the ice but in Silas himself, a hairline fracture in the resigned acceptance he'd worn like armor for 30 years. He pulled his numb hand from the water and reached for the steel bar he kept in his truck for breaking ice in water troughs. The weight of it felt different now, not like a tool for maintaining someone else's property but like an instrument of choice, heavy with possibility. The first blow sent spider web cracks radiating outward from where the bar struck, sound echoing across the empty pasture like a gunshot. The geese startled but didn't flee. They couldn't, so they watched as Silas brought the bar down again, and again, each strike more forceful than the last. Ice shattered and flew, dark water welling up through the breaks like something held underwater finally allowed to breathe. With each swing, something else cracked open in Silas. 30 years of swallowed words. 30 years of deferred dreams. 30 years of living like a guest in his own life, grateful for scraps and afraid to ask for the meal he'd earned. The ice gave way in jagged pieces, and the geese began to move, cautiously at first, then with growing strength as open water spread around them. "Go on," Silas urged them, his voice hoarse from cold and exertion. "You're free now. Go." But they didn't leave immediately. The female goose swam in small circles, testing her wings, while her mate preened ice crystals from his feathers with methodical care. They moved together, unhurried now that panic had passed, taking time to remember how to be untrapped. Silas watched them prepare for flight with the patience he'd never granted himself, understanding for the first time that freedom required more than just breaking free. It required remembering how to use what had been frozen. The sunrise painted the water gold and red, colors that transformed the pond from mirror to window. Silas could see all the way to the bottom now, could see the mud he'd shaped with his own hands, the life that had persisted beneath winter's grip. Fish moved in slow schools through the deeper water, and cattail roots waited for spring's permission to push toward light. When the geese finally took flight, their wings beat strong and sure, carrying them southwest toward warmth and possibility. Their calls echoed back to him across the brightening sky, not desperate now but triumphant, a sound that said survival was just the beginning, not the end of the story. Silas walked back to his truck, but his steps had changed. The crunch of frozen earth under his boots no longer sounded like breaking glass. It sounded like a man walking with purpose, each footfall a small declaration of presence. He climbed into the cab and sat for a moment with the engine running, watching steam rise from the pond where ice had given way to open water. The crumpled payment notice was still in his pocket, but it felt lighter now, just paper instead of verdict. The Hammond farm would still die, that hadn't changed, but Silas Morrow was no longer dying with it. Somewhere south of Bison, there were ranches that needed men who knew cattle and weather and how to make something grow in difficult ground. Somewhere there were places that would know his name and use it. He pulled out of the drive slowly, gravel crunching under the truck tires like applause. In the rear-view mirror, the pond reflected the sky again, but now it also reflected possibility. The ice was breaking everywhere, on the water, in the air, in the spaces between what was and what could be. Silas Morrow drove toward the highway with his window cracked open, breathing the cold morning air like a man learning to be alive again. The geese were long gone, flying toward spring, but their cries still echoed in his memory. Not of desperation now, but of recognition. one wild thing acknowledging another, one trapped soul saluting another's escape into the wide, uncertain, beautiful sky of choice. If Silas Morrow's story touched your heart, if it reminded you of the quiet strength that lives in ordinary people facing extraordinary moments of choice, or if it lit a spark of hope in your own winter season, please give this video a thumbs up and share it with someone who needs to remember that it's never too late to break the ice that's been holding them. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel. We tell stories that heal, inspire, and prove that courage can emerge from the most unexpected places, even after 30 years of waiting. We'll see you soon. Never stop believing in the power of second chances.